Well, thank you so much, Leahi, for that awesome introduction. My name is Tanya Lee-Greig, as she mentioned. So my ohana comes from Makena area. My grandmother was raised in Kanahena. So if you've ever been out toward the lava fields and right before you go into what is Ahihikina'o Reserve, that nice, beautiful bay, that's where my grandmother was raised, right? And then my ohana then moved further in this way. And so coming from this space allows for an interesting perspective on the lands of on this on the lands of this area, right? And then I just so happen to be an archaeologist, which also helps that lens as well. So what I'm going to go through today with you is a sort of like the 10,000 foot elevation, right? So when you're down in the weeds, you really don't really see everything, the big picture, right? And how different perspectives, different worldviews interact with what's on the land, right? So we're gonna go up to the 10,000 foot elevation and we're gonna kind of see this broad overview, and then we're gonna kind of bring it back down just really briefly. So we're gonna go through maybe 800 years of history in 30 minutes. So I'm hopefully we'll do it some justice, but know that there are resources out there if you want to get into the weeds. If there's something that piques your interest in the slides, there are resources available to you both academically as well as internally within your organization. I'm looking at you, but and I'm looking at you, Leahi. So there are experts in this room, right, that know a whole bunch more than I do. So know that you have a great wealth of resources and knowledge just in your organization alone. Yep. So Honua'ula, right? What is Honua'ula? Honua'ula is the overall space that we're in. So we're just going to start at that 10,000 foot level and look at in terms of what is the mo'olelo of Honua'ula. So are you familiar with this term, mo'olelo? Raise your hands. Okay, so mo'olelo, for those who know, this is going to be review, but for those who don't, mo'olelo is the oral traditions. They are the stories of the people, right? And land has a mo'olelo, people have mo'olelo. So we're gonna look at what is the story of Honua'ula. And we're gonna start with what is the name of Maui in and of itself? What are the poetic names? Hawaiians had this amazing, amazing capacity for poetry, looking at things in a very intricate way and understanding that. So one of the earliest names for Maui Island, which we are on, is Maui Nui Akama, right? And Maui Nui Akama is the lands of Kamalalawalu, right, and his children, right? And so that is one story. Kamalalawalu was a chiefly person. We call them a mo'i of the Aina of Maui Nui, and so in this space, it is well known. So we revere our chiefs, we revere our ali'i, we revere our people in the names of places and spaces, and that's going to come to you. That's going to I'll elaborate more on that in a little bit. So Hawaiian worldview, this is just touching on some of the aspects of Hawaiian worldview. What constitutes Hawaiian worldview? We have the Kumulipo, which is the Hawaiian creation story, the Genesis story, which you may find parallels to other Genesis stories in other cultures. Olelo no Ia, or Hawaiian proverbs. How do we understand our space and learn lessons from that, right? How do we describe our people in these proverbs and learn lessons from those types of sayings? And then wahi'inoa, or names of places. Each name of a place has meaning, right? And we'll get into that. So this is a lot, and I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but there's a couple of things that I kind of want to point out here. One is in the first stanza of the Kumulipo. And it speaks about a time when the earth became hot, right? That primordial, that initial phase, right? That lava flow that comes from Kilauea, that comes from Mauna Kea, that comes from Haleakala, the initial heat of earth and creation of that. But what is striking here is that in the Hawaiian creation story, and again, I am not a complete expert in this. I would defer to others in this room to fill you in on the details and also the deep, deep kauna or underlying meaning of these stanzas. But everything is shrouded in darkness, right? From the darkness comes the light. And from the depth of the ocean, all life comes forward, right? So a little bit of parallels there with other types of creation stories. But one I do want to point out is the first thing, the first living being, if you will, to be born out of the ocean is the koa, or a koa koa, the coral polyp, right? And that is very significant. It becomes very significant when we look at our sacred spaces. And we'll touch a little bit more on that when we go through our ceremonial spaces. So keep that in mind. Keep all of these things in mind. This is just one stanza of a very long creation oli. So just thinking about how Hawaiians view our own creation and the importance of coral ako'akoa in that. Next, we come to Olelo No'eau. How do we see our world in terms of the community? How do we see our world, the specifics of our space? And so there are a few Olelo No'eau or Hawaiian proverbs that I wanted to share with you that speak to the characteristics of Honua Ula, right? Honua Ula, whose shoulders are pummeled by the moa'e wind. Hawaiians had this amazing way of naming every characteristic of every wind, and every wind had a name. One of those names is the moa'e wind, and it would pummel the shoulders of those who lived here, right? So it's, at the end of the day, it also tells us that Honua Ula is a crazy windy space, right? And if you've been out on the lava fields, or if you've been up Mauka, you know that these are the winds that pummel your shoulders, right? Papa is of Honua Ula, Naulu is at Kanaloa. So Kanaloa, also a name in reference to Kaho'olawe. And if you're familiar with your own space, Naulu Farm, right? So what does that mean? That's the long cloud that extends from Ulupalakua all the way to Kaho'olawe, right? And it's that cloud that brings this rain that then allows for growth on the Aina, right? And so it's not just a Naulu cloud, it's the Naulu rain, right? And it's this connecting rain between Honua Ula and Kaho'olawe that kind of brings us all together, right? And then Honua Ula Kua La'ola'o, right? The callous back of Honua Ula. And what that speaks to is an understanding of the sometimes difficult way or difficult nature of our terrain here, right? We don't have beautiful perennial streams where the waters flow down to the sea all the time, sometimes, but not all the time, right? So it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of labor to be able to thrive in a space when the only way that you can thrive is through fishing and through agriculture, right? So it's a specific reference to the hard working people of Honua Ula, because if you don't have calluses on your back and on your hands, then you may not be able to make it through that time, right? So the Honua Ula, hard workers, and I'm sure I have folks in this room who can speak to the amount of effort and labor it takes to even maintain some of your spaces in here, given the environment that we're in and the terrain that surrounds us. And then we have our place names, our wahi'i noa. So Hawaiians had a way of understanding their space through generations and across hundreds of years. And this knowledge manifested in how they would name the places in which they lived, right? And it could be a reflection of a wetter time, apua kehau, being, this is actually a point and a fish pond. Actually, you can see it on this photo. So apua kehau here, a basket of dew, right? Maybe speaking to a wetter time, maybe speaking to the waters of the fish pond, you know, potentially. Kanenelu, the bog. It's a reference to a boggy type place, a wet type place. And this is a land section in the Ahupua'a of Papa'a Nui. But if you know Papa'a Nui being a dry and sort of burnt kind of space, this word of this one particular place potentially may have been one space where there was water in that Ahupua'a, possibly. And sometimes we can refer to these spaces to give us an idea in archaeology about what we might find in these places. Right? Keawanui, that's pretty obvious. It's a big bay. Makena or Makena. One interpretation of Makena is abundance, a place where there was plentiful of fish, plentiful of sea life, plentiful agriculture. Another interpretation without the kahako or the macron over the A is a calm bay, calm of sea or calm atmosphere. I don't know if you can see from this photo, and it always strikes me, and it's not always this way. Sorry. This is Makena, part of Makena Bay right in here, right? So if you see out in here, it's kind of choppy. And then right when you get in close, right between these, the lie here and here, the points here, it gets a little calmer, right? So for me, it's not always the case. I've seen some big waves come in, crash on that beach. But sometimes when you're just on the inside of those points there, it can be relatively calm when everything else outside of it is rough. And then Pu'uola'i, this hill right here, that is the name of that cinder cone right there, Pu'uola'i, right? And the mo'olelo behind that is Earthquake Hill, right? So the mo'olelo behind Pu'uola'i is that cinder cone is the tail of the Mo'o'inaina, and Molokini, just in front of it, is the head of Inaina. And she had a battle with Pele. She was a little bit messing around with Pele's man, and Pele got mad and cut her in half, right? And so Pu'uola'i being the tail of the mo'o, if you ever have messed with a mo'o, you know that tail just kind of shakes, right? And sometimes you can cut that tail off and that tail continues to shake, right? So potentially that is also a reference possibly to that mo'olelo, right? An interpretation, one of many. So coming from that worldview, that 10,000 foot elevation, right? And understanding how Hawaiian traditions view the landscape in its totality. Now we're gonna move down to how do Hawaiians manage that landscape, right? And that's the kalai'aina. So, and what we mean by that's the cutting up of the land. So under fifth generation ali'i kaka alaneo was the first kalai'aina, right? And what I mean by that is the first division of lands. And so you start to get to terms like mokupuni, moku, right? So in Western terms, your mokupuni is the island, right? Mokupuni o Maui. So you might hear that, mokupuni o Maui. Kaka'alaneo with his kahuna then split the island into 12 districts or moku, right? So think of it in those terms. So right now we are in the moku of Honua'ula, right? Not in Ahupua'a, a moku of Honua'ula. And this moku, this land division, extends from Pohakupalaha here on the other side of Haleakala crater and comes down and follows the Southwest Rift Zone, which in and of itself is a landmark and a great one for this moku division, and then fans out and encompasses Kaho'olawe, right? So Kaho'olawe is keiki to Honua'ula, right? And an Ahupua'a in and of itself. So when you hear the term moku, you hear the term Honua'ula. This is what it is in reference to this entire land division right here. Okay. The lands were then further divided into Ahupua'a. Does anybody know what an Ahupua'a is? Raise of hands, who is familiar with the term Ahupua'a? Okay. So an aupua'a is the most traditional form of land management for Hawaiians or for Hawaiian culture. In Honua'ula, we have some 29 aupua'a, going from Pai'ahu, which is, now you can refer to it like Wailea, right? So like the edge of the fire station is the boundary of Honua'ula and the northern boundary of Pai'ahu, right? So all the way from the Wailea fire station. And it comes around and goes all the way to Kanaio, right? So in that, there are 29 aupua'a, roughly. ATC Makena, or the lands upon which Makena Golf and Beach Club encompass about 11 of those 29 aupua'a, right? So that's a very large area and a big kuleana for all you folks. So right now, for us, we are here. Well, where are we? We are here in Moluaka, right? Pu'ola'i here. Makena Bay is up in there, just so you know where you're at in this realm. So, which aupa are we in? Maluaka. What moku are we in? Exactly. And what is the name of that cinder cone? Yes. And that is the first step in understanding where you are in time and space, right? When you can illustrate that and you start to understand where these divisions are, how these landscapes shift with those divisions, you gain a greater understanding for all of the things and all of the spaces and all of the emotions that the people of this place feel on a daily basis. So we got our Hawaiian worldview. How do we operate? What are our behaviors? How do we know these things? We have the kalai aina, the mahele aina, that takes us through and gives responsibilities to the different chiefs who manage the ahupua'a. What are we doing on this aina here in Honua'ula? We are farming. We are fishing. So in this space, because we have an interesting terrain and it can be quite formidable, there is a development of a specific type of agriculture, and that is called the Makena field system, right? Or that was coined to be the Makena field system, and it takes advantage of all of the ridges and the spaces, with terracing, with living spaces. So in this photo here, you can sort of see, I don't know if you can make this out quite well, but there are spaces in here. So this is down slope. You see this construction here and leveling off in here. Terracing, habitation areas, living spaces where the people would be able to farm anything from sweet potato or uala to kalo. Well, the beauty of this is that it also informs you how these areas were used. So maybe in certain areas, development doesn't make sense, right? Maybe in certain areas where traditionally we know these areas get flooded out, it doesn't quite make sense there. Maybe this tells us also, this helps us to understand how people utilize these spaces, how people lived in these spaces, and there's value in preserving these spaces instead of completely removing them from the landscape, right? And so while it may look like a pile of rocks, when you actually get out here and you understand it, and then you see the breadth of it, and you're like, holy moly, there's like 100 terraces here. How many people did it take to maintain this space? How did they organize the labor to be able to maintain this space, right? To make it productive for the population that was here. Because right now, what you're seeing here in population-wise is potentially a fraction of what it was at the time that these spaces were used. And they worked with the landscape that they were in to be able to have it be productive for them. So now I'm gonna like go off my script in my head. But the other thing that we can learn from these spaces, right, through archaeology, is by understanding what was grown in these spaces, we can understand what this landscape can support, right? What kinds of plants make sense for this landscape? What kinds of vegetation makes sense for the rainfall levels here, right? And so with archaeology, we can put down an archaeological test unit in here, retrieve a soil sample, and I can tell you exactly what was growing in that terrace. We found starches from sweet potato. We found pollen from dryland kalo. Now, if you look at the space just back from the bay there, that doesn't look like much of anything. It's super dry and it's brushy and there's kiawe everywhere. But in the terraces themselves, there's pollen from kalo. There's starches from sweet potato, uwala. There is pollen or wood charcoal from plants that have not seen the light of day at this elevation for a very, very long time, right? So now that we know that these plants were here, maybe then we can start bringing back the plants that make sense, right? So this is just an archaeological rendition of what you just saw, or an example of what you just saw. So again, these terraces and the McKenna Field system being a system where your living spaces was toward the top of the slope because that's what makes sense, because it's flat up there, and taking advantage of the downstream or taking advantage of the rainfall and the drainage. That's the word I'm looking for. The drainage to be able then to sort of feed and maintain the agricultural terraces below. Makes sense, yeah? So from the agricultural side, we go to our Lavaita side. And the people of McKenna are very well known to be fishermen. And whether it's to go out into the middle of the channel and go fishing on the Va'a, or today in a regular boat, to communal fishing, whether it's through Hukilao, which is a communal effort. It took families to be able to participate in this gathering of akule that, I don't know, has been a little while. It's been a long while since Hukilao. So always understanding that, coupled with the agricultural aspect, we have our marine lifeways, right? In Honua'ula, we don't just have open ocean fishing. We don't just have bay fishing or fishing out in the communal bay areas, but we also have fish ponds, right? We have one at Apua Kehau, and there are a multitude of fish ponds that you think to yourself, how are people living out here on the A'a? But they are, and they're making use of these spaces, right? So if you go out to Keoneo'io or La Perouse Bay, there are fish ponds out in that area. There are what sometimes we refer to our sort of coolers in the middle of the fish pond with the ankyline ponds in the middle. All of those have been modified to be able to accommodate whatever it is the people of the time needed, right? However they needed to maintain their catch for that day. So when you talk to kupuna, sometimes they'll say, oh, I think that those ankyline ponds out there in the middle of the A'a probably used to preserve the fish that was gathered for that one time, right? So all of this together, Honua'ula, very strong agricultural people, very strong in terms of fishing. So going back to the Kalai'aina and understanding where we are at, and that the management of the system wasn't just for the ocean, not just for the land, but also the fishery of Molokini, right? So everyone was assigned a kuleana. Every area, every family who resided in Ahupua'a had certain areas that they could fish, certain areas that they couldn't. So the story of Molokini, the fishery of Molokini, goes back to understanding who had the right to fish at Molokini, right? Not just everybody. So in correspondence, we come to understand that Pa'anui, for Pa'anui, their fishery was Molokini, right? So the people of Pa'anui had the rights to fish at Molokini. So just an example of that 10,000 foot level about the intricacies of land management and ocean management for our people. It wasn't a free for all. It was heavily managed and respected in that way. And then this is in all aspects of life, whether it's agriculture, whether it's fishing, and whether it's state organization, there was ritual and ceremony, right? And these structures, these monumental structures, ranged from large heiau, or what we refer to as temples, to ko'a, which we refer to as sort of smaller shrines. Yeah. This one if you've been to the corner of Honoiki Road and Old McKenna Road, this is on that corner. This is a part of your kuleana, right? This is a fishing ko'a that is on that corner, right? And if you remember, you think back to the kumulipo, that first living thing that came out of the ocean, coral, right? Ko'a. We refer to these types of fishing shrines as ko'a, and you will find a whole lot of ko'a in offering on these shrines. So thinking back to the connectivity, 10,000 foot level, coming back down to the reality and the base in the weeds. Arrival of Western vessels in 19th century change. There's a whole lot of change going to happen in Honua'ula following 1778, the arrival of Captain Cook, right? And the unification of the islands under Kamehameha Pai'ea, right? Not Kamehameha Nui. I saw a social media post recently attributing the unification of the islands to Kamehameha Nui. That was an entirely different individual. So Kamehameha Pai'ea. And the introduction of Christianity thereafter, right? So this is Keawala'i Church. This has often been referred to as a piko of Makena. The families that are laid to rest in this cemetery, their descendants are still in this space, right? So to get an idea of how literally and figuratively our family lines and our family lineages are tied to this aina, this is sort of like a ground. It can be thought of today as this grounding space, right? So Keawala'i is here, and it was the meeting space for life, for worship for a very long time. And then the Mahele Aina. So what did the Mahele Aina do? The Mahele Aina began in 1848, around there. And what that did is it codified and put on paper the Kalai Aina that we referred to earlier, right? So it was known through oral tradition about the boundaries, and the boundaries extending from Pohakupalaha all the way down along this ridge line. What was committed to memory by those specialists who knew it was now committed to paper as a result of the Mahele Aina. And then we begin this idea or this role into fee simple ownership, right? And so with that, things begin to change here in Makena. And a new commercial era and agricultural landscape emerges, right? One that revolves first around the potato trade, which expanded upon that which traditional Hawaiians had already built for this aina. And it moved eventually into ranching, which are some of these long walls that you might see, right? This new agricultural landscape. And a connectivity continued between the folks from the Makai reaches because of the landing spot at Makena Landing. That was the main port, right? That's where things were coming in and out. Things were happening, right? And so this whole landscape shifts subtly, right? The families who are here shift into a different type of economy, right? So those are all fun stories, but is that still reflected today? Absolutely. And we see it in the archaeology, right? So I'm just gonna orient you here. This is Makena Landing Park. Not Makena Landing. Makena Landing's over here, but Makena Landing Park, right? And then the church is here, right? So this is Hawaii Road. So one would think, what are you going to find there? Is the landscape still even there? Absolutely. So now the stories and the newspaper clippings and the mo'olelo, they are reflected on the landscape now. This is the physical footprint of those stories, right? The ridge lines that are contoured with terraces, with living spaces at the top, right? The boundary walls that formed boundaries of these 19th century plantations, right? And the old road from the landing at Makena up this way that would eventually go up to Ulupalakua. The same road maybe that Kalakaua came on when he was going up to Ulupalakua and hanging out with Mr. Maki, right? So all of these spaces and the intricacy in which the traditional Hawaiian agricultural landscape is underlain or overlaid by this 19th century and early 20th century culture change is still very prominent on this landscape. And so when you hear the term cultural landscape, it's that connectivity or that connection of the physical and its connection to the mo'olelo, its connection to those newspaper clippings, its connection to the stories that you hear. Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Just the last photo. When was that photo taken?
So this photo is the 2019, I think, the underlaying aerial. And then the archaeology over the top is recent. Okay, mahalo.